My next speaker is Eleni Ciliazzi. Sorry. I apologise for that. And she's talking about freedom behind bars, a lived experience of anorexia and in prison, the linking that thought patterns. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, and it's a real honour to be here. And I hope that in speaking of these issues, it shows the testament to the help I had from a forensic psychologist. My personal experience has always been in education. Oh, clicker, I needed to know where that was. In education, in health, physical education, in the fitness industry. But I never thought that my lived experience would be to experience life behind bars. It was never on my bucket list. But with the help of a forensic psychologist, she helped me see the one dominant thought pattern that spanned over 40 years between the two circumstances. So this is me when I was 3 years old. I loved singing, still do. Karaoke is one of my go-to things for my mental health. And if anyone has seen my Big Fat Greek Wedding, that was basically my upbringing. My brother and I went and saw the movie and we laughed our heads off because it was exactly the same. And we went back and told Mum and Dad, "You've got to go see it." And they said, "What's so funny about it?" after they saw it, because it was exactly their life. But in telling my story, I am not laying blame on any one person. It's a whole lot of circumstances that lead to a mental illness, and a whole lot of circumstances, depending on how you see it, that your life pans out. So for me, I was the eldest of 4 children. My sister and my twin brothers did not develop the thought patterns that I developed, but I was a quieter kind of person, and this is my story of how I saw things as I went through this journey. So Dad's classic line in my mid-teens was, "Subjects closed, don't want to talk about it." Each time I asked to do something that normal teenagers do, like going out with your friends, it was, "No, you're not doing that, subjects closed." So I never learnt how to talk about and articulate how I was thinking and feeling. It was, you don't do that, you're not allowed to do that. That's how I was brought up. And I took that into my marriage. So I thought, in hearing that all the time, that my parents didn't love me. That's how I interpreted it. I'm not good enough to be listened to and loved. So this was from about the age of 15 on. So I thought, if I'm not a good enough daughter, maybe I can do more around the house to become a good enough daughter, because I'm contributing. So I did all the housework without being asked to every week, hoping that they now saw me as good enough, and that if I asked to do something that my friends were doing, they would say yes. But it didn't happen, so I just kept trying and trying. And then we went to Greece when I finished year 12, and I thought my only place that I saw my friends was school. School was now finished, so I got a bit sad. I didn't know what anxiety and depression were at that time. I didn't know the signs and symptoms. I do know now that changes in eating habits, changes in sleeping habits are 2 of some signs of mental illness developing. But I just was eating less. I wasn't sleeping properly. I never weighed myself. I never dieted. I never worried about my body, ever. But when Mum and Dad noticed I wasn't eating as much, they said, "Are you okay? What's wrong? You're not eating as much." And I, in my thought patterns, went, "Oh, you're listening to me now." And then I went, if I start eating, are you going to not listen to me now, or am I not going to be able to talk about this? And I interpreted their asking me as now they love me. So it did turn into a fear of eating, but not for any body image or number on the scale. It turned into a fear as if I start eating, am I going to lose my parents' love in inverted commas? And that lasted for over 2 years. I lost my menstrual cycle for 5 years. It turned into full-blown anorexia. And when we came back to Sydney, I went to my GP who'd known me since I was 4, and he said, I believe you're suffering anorexia. And I said, what's that? People that live with an eating disorder do not wake up one day and go, I am going to do these behaviours to have this illness. I had no idea what it was. But by that stage, I was too frightened to lose my parents' love. And I will get to the next point I've got there, real me versus crushed me, decades later when I had the help of a psychologist, not for an eating disorder, but she was a forensic psychologist. She broke my therapy into real me and crushed me. And I chose this photo because I believe in that age there was real me, and then life happened and all the cracks around the edge was crushed me. So I started living out of crushed me behaviour. So the lie of anorexia, I've told you a little bit of my experience there. I was not able to express my emotions. I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to articulate them. And I didn't know who I was and if I was important. And the anorexia became an identity for me. It spoke louder than what I could articulate in words. And I was too frightened to let it go. So when I was asked, often by people, I had comments made, why don't you eat more? Why are you exercising so much? Don't you like food? I would clam up and I'd go, don't you dare take this away from me. I wouldn't say it, but I was thinking it. Don't you dare take this away from me because I don't know how to cope if you do. I hadn't learned any good tools. I hadn't learned how to express myself. So I didn't want anyone to challenge me on those behaviours. The behaviours of doing all the chores and doing more and more at home translated into the behaviour of anorexia. Restrict your eating more, exercise more, do more, or you won't be worth it. You won't be loved, you won't be listened to. It had nothing to do with body image for me. And I know for a lot of people it does, but for me it wasn't. And this was in the early 80s when there was not much said and not much therapy around eating disorders. And I was really grateful I had a GP that read up on everything. And I hated living like that. I hated waking up only thinking about what I had eaten the day before, how much exercise I'd done to burn it off, what I was going to eat that day, what I was going to do to burn it off. And I'd forgotten everything else about myself that I enjoyed and that I liked. And for my poor parents, not knowing how to deal with this, I can't imagine what they went through as parents. I didn't want to live like that. It was not a conscious choice to wake up one day and live with an eating disorder. And I liken it to a quote from The Shawshank Redemption. Has anyone not seen it? I'm glad. Oh, you haven't? If you haven't, have a look at it. There's a scene in there, and if you have seen it, where Brooks, who's an older man that had been incarcerated for about 40 years, is released, and Morgan Freeman, who plays Red, says, these walls are funny. At first you hate them, and then you get used to them, and then you can't live without them. And that's exactly what I liken, whether it's an addiction to a substance or a behavioural addiction. That's how I felt. I didn't know how to live without those rules I imposed on myself, without feeling a sense of value, because I didn't value who I was. So fast forward 20 years from my teens, I never had psychological help. I physically recovered. I have 3 adult children, so that was something I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do with a loss of menstrual cycle for 5 years. And then in the last 8 years of my 21-year marriage, when my children were independent of me and I was able to go back to work a few days a week, a whole lot of negative talk and controlling behaviours started coming from my ex-husband. I never had a girls' night out in 21 years. I was married. As soon as I started going back to work 3 days a week, it was, why are you late home from work? I'd get a call 10 minutes late home. Why aren't you home? I'm having a coffee with my girlfriend. You've got responsibilities at home. Get home. And because I never learnt how to speak up, I just submitted and came home. I loved singing and wanted to do singing lessons. He would hit the walls. You're just a loud Greek. You like the attention. And this had never surfaced before. It was as soon as I became independent as a mother and a wife and was able to have some life outside of being a housewife and mum, which I loved. And I didn't realise those things that I was experiencing were domestic violence. I thought they were my normal. The hitting walls, the throwing things, the put downs. So I started disliking who I was. I thought, then the same thought patterns creeped up. I'm not a good enough wife, not a good enough daughter. You've got to try harder. So I tried harder by doing things that I knew he would like doing. I started doing the lawns for him, started washing his car, and I started seeing I'm doing exactly the same thing as I did in my teens. And then as the emotions intensified that I didn't know how to deal with, I found myself going into the same way I only knew how to cope. I started eating less and running more. And my daughter was 16, 2 boys followed her, and I thought if I continue, I recognised what I was doing, and I thought if I continue doing this, I'm going to teach my kids that this is how you cope. So I took myself to the doctor, had a breakdown, was diagnosed with severe depression, and for the first time in my life put on medication and saw a psychologist. But it got worse before it got better because my ex-husband was not supportive of me having any sort of therapy or being on medication. So I'm glad people are here. I'm glad there is more mental health education because it's not just the professional that supports you, it's the people around you every single day that uphold what that professional does once a week or once a fortnight. And if you don't have that support from people around you, it's not going to be as effective. So we separated because it wasn't helpful for me to stay with him as I was trying to get better. And it got worse and worse. And there was one session, and I'll say this, it's quite personal, but I'm hoping that it helps paint the rest of the picture. One session where he agreed 6 months after separation to have counselling together. And in the last 8 years, I felt that he only loved me for the housework I did and for sex. Whether that was a true thought or not, I didn't know. But in this session together, he was asked 2 questions. He was asked, what do you understand of Eleni? And I thought this would be good. And he said, I don't know. I only know when she's around, the house runs smoothly. So I went, thought number 1 confirmed. And then he was asked, what do you miss of Eleni? And in that last 2 years, I didn't like him seeing me naked because I felt that's all he loved. And he answered that question with, I miss seeing her naked. I thought I was at rock bottom before that, but I hit rock bottom, and 6 weeks after that made some poor decisions that broke the law. I was arrested 4.5 years later. My self-worth was rock bottom. I hadn't told a soul in that 4.5 years. I almost took my life twice because of the shame that I felt. My whole life I thought I had to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter, the perfect educator. And now I had been arrested and I have done something wrong. How do I face this? How do I face telling my parents, who my whole life I thought I had to please, my children, my ex-husband, how do I face this? I am no longer perfect. What is perfect? So I started seeing a forensic psychologist. I was on conditional bail for 13 months, and my lawyer said, I need you to see a forensic psychologist, and she was the best thing that ever happened to me. She took me through therapy once a week right up to sentencing, and we went right back through the early childhood and particularly focused on the anorexia. She wasn't an eating disorder specialist. As I said, it was nothing to do with my body weight. It was getting to the why. Why in the first place? And I had my first light bulb moment with her in the second session. She said, what was your dominant thought when you lived with anorexia? And I went, so one single thought was, if I don't do this, I won't be of value. And then she said, okay, right before offending, what was your dominant thought? And I sat back and slumped. And it was this, exactly the same thought. If I don't do this, I won't be of value. 30 years apart, I lived with that thought. If I don't do this, I won't be of value. And then I thought, why did I not get help for this in my teenage years instead of living with that thought? And I wonder how many people live with that thought, I'm not worth it if I don't people please, if I don't put my hand up and say yes to everything, even though I'm exhausted inside. I'm not of value unless I say yes to everything. And I burst into tears because I thought I've lived with this thought for decades. And it was a whole lot of unlearning that I had to do. And it was the most difficult experience I've ever had. Just a few facts on women that end up in prison. And I now work with women who have been impacted by the justice system, whether they've been incarcerated or community order. 17% entering prison had a parent or carer incarcerated during their childhood. 65% reported having mental illness diagnosis before incarceration. 36% reported having head injury resulting in a loss of consciousness. And most of the women I work with now have an assault charge against them when they've gone to defend themselves against a perpetrator, and they end up with the assault charge. 70 to 90% of women have experienced abuse or domestic violence. 61% of incarcerated women reported using methamphetamines in the last 12 months. It used to be heroin that was the drug that most people were in prison for. It's now ice, and I've got a study written underneath there because I learnt of the number of women incarcerated that had lived with an eating disorder that used methamphetamines as a means of weight control. So, and that study was one that touched on it with 3 subjects. So if you're interested in more needs to be done on that, because they then end up with a record and a whole lot of other medical complications as well. 52% reported high to very high levels of psychological distress on entry to prison, and 30% reported very high. I can't tell you how scary prison was. You're on guard 24 hours a day. It's the unknown. And if I hadn't had that psychological help in the community before I was sentenced, I would not have coped with what prison was like. I had to apply every bit of mental strength to keep those tools up here and to use them. Most people don't have that support, and the judge's sentencing comments said that I was to continue having once a week psychological support in prison. In the 11 months I was in there, I had 2 sessions. The services do not happen in prison. They're short-staffed and overpopulated. And most women are incarcerated for less than 6 to 12 months. I won't go through all of these, but you can imagine the impact on your mental health when you are separated from your family and loved ones, isolated, you're not called by your name, you have a MIN number. Mine was 522475, never forget that. Always called by your surname, Salakis. You have limited access to services. You now have trauma of incarceration on top of trauma that you've experienced before. The strip searches, I'll mention that one. You are strip searched after every single visit you have. And I can't tell you, they said to me, you'll get used to it. I never did. And then I had a second light bulb moment. It was 3 months into incarceration, and I was struggling to hang on to that unlearning that I had. And I thought I could starve myself to death here. I could do that because I hated what I was going through and the shame that I'd brought my family and myself. And I had a second light bulb moment sitting on the floor of Silverwater Cell, and it was, if I do that, then I have learnt nothing from this whole experience. And from that moment on, I determined to use every bit of my professional experience and my lived experience to educate the community and to help women that have gone through the same thing. When you are released, the impacts of your mental health because of discrimination, exclusion, the labelling, people don't see the trauma that you've had before you offend or the rehabilitation that you've done. Many people just see the record. And I've had so much support from family and friends, but the hardest thing was around employment, the tick the box with a criminal record. And the two biggest factors to reoffending are lack of housing, homelessness and employment for men and women leaving prison. The impact that it had on my mental health, even though I had a vast range of professional experience, was you're not good enough. Now you've got a label. You should be ashamed. It sent me right back to the thoughts before offending. And I put my foot down in my head and went, I'm no longer going to use the word my in front of anorexia or my depression or my offence, because it does not define me. It is not me. It was something that happened, and I've risen above that. And this is my last slide, so sorry if I've gone a bit over time. That cliche thing about loving yourself, if you don't, you'll try every other means to justify your sense of worth. And we are all human first. We're not a label. And in prison, I was standing in the medication line to get my antidepressant, and it was a prison I was moved to. So it was in the first week I was in this new prison, and a female officer tapped me on the shoulder. She must have seen the fear on my face. And she said, hey, there's a fine line between blue and green. Any one of us can be on the other side of the fence. And that stayed with me, and I'm hoping it stays with you, because if this was your wife, your sister, your grandmother, your niece, your auntie, if it was yourself, would you want to be defined by this for the rest of your life? No. Thank you.